So let's start. Um, my colleague here, Luc Robert from the NICC in Belgium. Myself, I also do work at the NICC, and Benjamin Min is not with us. He stayed in Brussels to have the magnificent weather of Belgium. It's worse there than here. So, yeah, it's good we are here. Um, we will. I, I'll speak about something quite unusual in this field. I mean mobility studies. Mobility studies is a dynamic research field based on a specific interest on movement and on the idea of a mobility turn. It means the idea that we are facing uh, until, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, great shifts regarding our relationship with mobility. But this research field is now shifting from geographers and urban planners towards sociologists and anthropologists, and also sometimes criminologists. There's quite a strong development of carceral geographies, so an interest of geographers but also criminologists for prison and other forms of incarcerations, but through the point of view of the space and the use of space. Uh, it's in my own research. It's a key concept I use to try to understand contemporary societies in many of their aspects. So today I'll talk about sexual offenses and Belgian reforms and try to analyze them from the point of view of the mobility studies. In Belgium, in the years 90s, there were highly publicized sexual offenses that created a great emotion amongst the population, the creation of victim advocacy groups, and also the development of public protests. The most known is the White March in 96, which was quite a revolution and quite a shock for the political system in Belgium. Due to all these problems, a bunch of reforms were adopted. Criminal law changes regarding release regulations, involvement of victims in the execution of prison sentences, but also the shift of the authority to grant early release from the executive to administrative courts in 99, and then to fully fledged courts, the courts for the execution of sentences in 2007. Uh, the, the the early release is one of the occasions to impose geographical restrictions to sex offenders, because the CES can grant early release and put forward specific conditions, including the definition of no-go zones vis-à-vis the offender's victim, for instance. There's a discretionary use of geographical restrictions. It can come from communities or a neighborhood to provinces, and there are only 10 provinces in Belgium, so you can be banned from 1/10 of the Belgian territory. It can have a great impact on the sex offenders. It's applied to all offenders. It can be applied to all offenders, but only here in case of early releases. But on the sentencing level, there are also possibilities of geographical restrictions. The sentencing judge can bar the sex offender the right to live, stay, or enter in a zone for 1 to 20 years. It can begin after the execution of a prison sentence, but it can also be imposed without any prison penalty. The judge has to take into account the gravity of the offense and the resettlement possibilities of the convicted offender, and the CES can modulate the execution of the sentence and even decide not to apply it. The violations are quite strongly punished from 1 month to 6 months of imprisonment and from 100 to 1,000 euros fine. What's a mobility-based approach in this context? There's, I think, a growing interest in spatial constraints applied outside of prisons. For instance, electronic monitoring, residential restrictions, and so on. And we think there is a need to understand the role played by our representations of space-time to understand why these kind of measures are developing nowadays. The proposal is to define two ideal types of spatial management, the anchorage and the mobilitarian model, and to link them with two forms of social representation of time-space, what I call limit form and flow form. This is, yes? Yeah, I'm sorry. That's it. I forgot that I don't manage the two with the same keyboard, so don't hesitate to wave a flag if I forget once more. So this is the general proposal, the two models and 7 different, as it is now, it's just under development, 7 proposals of key concepts to understand and structure these measures. I will explain, it will become, I hope, a little more obvious. The first question to ask is, how do we structure space? If we intend to manage the relationships between someone and the space, we have to structure the space. The first and maybe the most obvious way of structuring space is to define borders. For instance, the walls of the prison are just borders. They can differentiate the inner and the outside of the inside and the outside of the prison. So it's just the definition of limits, and the key element in this system is that you belong to one or to the other side of the limit. For instance, inmates belong to the inside of the prison, but if you belong to the outside, you cannot just come in and have a look, just visit without any condition. For instance, the definition of no-go perimeters for sexual offenders can proceed from such a vision. On the contrary, you can define another way of structuring space through the representation of a network. The question is no more the definition of a clear border and being inside or outside of the perimeter. It's more a question of proximity and accessibility. The structure of the space emerges from the social practices in relation with the space and through the relationships between nodes. So the question is not if you are inside or outside, but what are your relationships with the prison? For instance, when you can go out and come back in, or when you are released, but under the threat of coming really soon if you breach an electronic monitoring regulation. So the question here is not the anchorage inside or outside, it's the question of your mobility in the space and the pattern of the compartments you can adopt in this space. For instance, regarding the sexual offenders, we could take the example of the prohibition to contacts with the victim. It's not a question of being in the province or in the town or not, but it's a question of the relationship you create or not with the victim. If you define space, you define time, because a certain social construction, representation of time, comes with a certain social representation of time. For instance, if you define borders, time has to be quite stable, because a border is linked to a stability. You cannot move the border every day. The wall of the prison doesn't move each day. And so does not the frontier between two states, for instance. So it's a time of stability and brutal changes, because there can changes can occur, but they won't occur progressively. They will occur through a redefinition of the border. For instance, this kind of time experience is the classical experience of time of a classical inmate. One day he is released, and then he goes out, and he has no relationships whatsoever with the prison. In a classical system in the 19th century, this is where it really was really obvious. One day you were an inmate, and the other day you weren't, and so you went out. The network requires an ever-flowing time, because in a network, a network is constantly adapting. Because it's regulated through the social practices, it evolves constantly. There's a constant change and erosion, and you cannot define a border in this kind of environment. So you are continuously adapting to a changing context. And for instance, the modern tracking systems and devices are quite oriented towards this. For instance, electronic monitoring can be adapted from one day to another. There's a difference between weekdays and weekends. And also you can just ask for an adaptation of the schedule depending on your work, your training, or your visits to a therapist, for instance. It's also the time that will be applied in a gradual release system, when you are gradually released and you get permissions to go out and still progressively shift from inside to outside of the prison. What is mobility in this context? Mobility is a time-space journey. I mean, it's just changing your spatial coordinates during a stretch of time. So in a world structured through borders, mobility is the crossing of borders. You are mobile when you cross a border. So in this model, which is based on borders and on anchorage inside the border, mobility is leaving an anchorage and making a journey towards another anchorage. So it's a teleological mobility from one point to another. And when you have to cross the border, you are restricted by the gatekeeper. There are conditions. There are conditions to go out of the prison. There are also conditions to be allowed to leave your house when you are under electronic monitoring. CES, for instance, is one of those gatekeepers. It's the court that can decide whether or not you can go out, at which condition, and at which condition you are obliged to come back into the prison. On the other side, in the mobilitarian system, in the flow form morphology, if there are no borders and if you're just immersed in a network, there's a constant move of the context, because the relationships between all the elements of a network are constantly evolving. So even if you try to stay immobile, you cannot be, because the other nodes of the network with which you are defining your position are themselves moving. So you are constantly moving. Even if if your conditions of release are not evolving, the social context may be your familial situation, your work, your training, and so on. So the mobility management through of sexual offenders and the use of tracking devices corresponds greatly to this sort of mobility. For instance, the question is not to immobilize you, to fix you inside the borders. It's more to have you adopt a good mobility, because mobility is seen as necessary. The question is not to lock the people in their homes, because everyone today knows or think this is no good for the reinsertions, but to encourage you to make you adopt the good mobilities and to be able to track them, to control if you are adopting a good mobility. So how do you control individual spatial practices? In the case of the anchorage, it's the role of the gatekeeper. The easiest way is to materialize borders. For instance, build a wall around the prison. That's the easiest. It's not the easiest way. It costs a lot of money. But when the wall is built, you precisely know when someone is trying to jump above it. So that's one of the possibilities. In absence of materializations, sorry, the question is the detection of forbidden crossings. So you can hire gatekeepers like policemen or social services and so on, but you can also hire more gatekeepers, for instance, through publicity about sexual offenders. When you say to someone that these people are sex offenders in your neighborhood or in your town, you have you try to make them gatekeepers, so people able to say, I have detected this person inside a forbidden area, for instance, uh, next to the entrance of a school where he cannot be found. On the other side, in the mobilitarian system, you cannot have a gatekeeper because you don't have any border, any gate to keep. So you have to promote acceptable mobilities. And so the strategy is more to create mobility monitoring. Monitoring is the definition of a record. You previously say, I will need those data in case of a problem. For instance, I will give him an ankle bracelet with a GPS system. So it will collect his position constantly. I won't use it every day. I won't go and see on my computer every day where he is. Is he inside, outside his house, in the good part of the city or not? But everything is recorded. So I can, when there is a problem that triggers an alarm, I can go and check all these movements. For it, the best example of this is the tracking of the mobile phones. Every mobile operator records your position, your connection to the antennas. And one day, maybe, you'll be a suspect in a file, and then we'll go to look in the past in those huge amounts of data, unused for the majority of them, just to check if you were there at this time. So that's the monitoring. It's very different from the gatekeeping. And so electronic monitoring with GPS tracking and mobile phone tracking are clearly linked to a totally different conception of space-time and mobility than the gatekeeping imaginary, so to say. So I thought I would only have 15 minutes, so I had 3 more criteria as I couldn't think of explaining. I won't be really long about it because I think we should discuss and maybe have a drink earlier than we thought we could do. We could have, but just a few words about the 3 criterias, 3 last criterias. The aim. The question is the aim of the intervention. In the anchorage model, the aim is to anchor the person at his right place, to make him fix in a position where we know we can find him back. In a mobilitarian model, it's more to learn him to correctly move and to manage his trajectory. It's a trajectory. We are here speaking about uh, um, uh, uh, physical spaces, but it's also a social trajectory. It's also a therapeutic trajectory. This is really difficult to say to a French-speaking person. Um, so I didn't talked about it, but you can apply this model also to social mobilities or to personal mobilities or to familial mobilities. So it's a whole way of seeing things, and the question of inflecting the trajectory of someone is something that's quite new and which is linked to the mobilitarian model in place of the encouraged model, who was founded on the imaginary that everyone had his own place in a society and had to be fixed at this place. Who is the offender in these representations? In the encourage model, the offender is a predator, is someone who is just creeping in a city, trying to find a prey. And so you'll see the development of prohibition of prohibited zones around schools, public parks, churches, and so on, just as if it was the aim was to prevent the predator to approach the river where the prey come to drink. So this is an imaginary very different from the imaginary in the mobilitarian model, where the offender is a relationship. He's someone the victim knows, and the aim is to prevent the perpetuation of the specific relationship between the author and and his victim. I say his because statistically, yeah, we have to be realistic. Um, so it's a really different. These are really different views of what an offender is. And for instance, in Belgium, the focus is set on the question of the relationship between the victim and the offender. But in the United States, for instance, there are a lot of measures aimed at preventing the predator to approach the prey, even if we know statistically that sexual offenses mostly occur inside the home or with relatives far more than with people you don't know. What's the resistance that can be developed by the offender? In an encouraged model, it's the model of the escape, just trying to jump the wall and run. Or the imaginary of smuggling. A smuggler is someone who knows the border exists, but who is able to deal with it and to cross it unnoticed. But in the mobilitarian model, the aim will be for the offender to become invisible. For instance, taking advantage for the incapacity of the state to deal with such an amount of that data. If you go in the wrong place, maybe the GPS tracks you, but maybe there is no one to see it. It's just like the CCTVs in town. There are a lot of it, and here that for a Belgian, it's really impressive the number of CCTVs. But is there anyone to look at it and see what's happening in the street? We can doubt it. So it's different approaches. So in conclusion, thanks. I had far more time than what I thought, so I'm really happy. And my first point is no more valid. It's still valid. You cannot develop a complex approach in 15 minutes, but I had far more than 15 minutes. In a mobility praising society as ours, I think there's a necessity of an interrogation about the way our relationships with time, space, and mobility shape our penal policies. So there's a strong link, I think, between our imaginary strongly linked to mobility and a very specific approach of space-time and the way we think we should act regarding the mobility of sex offenders, for instance, because some actions may seem really obvious or even seductive, like electronic monitoring. You just say the word, you say, we'll put people under electronic monitoring, and everybody applauds. So, why is it so? Why was it? Why don't we ask some question about the efficiency of it, the possibilities to help people to live better with those solutions, and we just say it's no prison, it's electronic monitoring, so it's great. So going through the questioning about space-time and mobility can help us to build a reflection about this. I thank you.